In the face of aggression, the quest for a decisive Ukrainian victory is not just a battle cry. It's a necessity for lasting peace in Europe. Our mission? Swift and unyielding support to Ukraine. Every decision made by the global community, from rapid military aid to strategic economic support, is crucial in tipping the scales towards victory. The role of leadership, both within Ukraine and across the free world, is more critical than ever. We're bolstering our efforts, not just for now, but for a sustainable future. By enhancing our strategic toolbox, politically, militarily, and economically, we prepare to meet and overcome every challenge. This panel explores how continuous global support and strategic planning are vital for Ukraine's victory, and how we can collectively secure a peaceful, stable Europe.
A very good morning to you all, and thanks for gathering here in significant numbers. I think it is a very interesting session because the organizers suggested to look at things which are not probably very popular to talk about. For example, not only imagining Ukraine's victory, but also imagining, for example, decoupling of the West from Ukraine, because as we see, lots of people say, well, the interests are diverging, and Bridge Colby is only one of them. And he's been mentioned so many times, I sometimes feel like he's participating, actually. There is also a question of what is realistic in this confrontation. And actually, I hope it's going to be a very intense and provocative discussion. And I would like to basically ask you to start with 2-3 minute sort of introduction, initial thoughts. They can be pretty much sort of random in a certain way, to give us the flavor of what is your first reaction when you see this sort of what's in the toolbox for Ukraine's victory. I would like to start with probably with Daniel.
Thank you, Konstantin. So, and good morning, everyone. I'm not gonna put on a brave face and tell everybody that the mistakes we made these 2 years, that they have not had any impact on Ukraine. They did. So most of our panelists yesterday focused on the military side, yes, on how to win a war. I would try to focus at least for a moment on how to win a peace, which means what comes after the war. This is my very own theory of victory, what we could attempt at, and this is free and independent Ukraine, able to secure its unhindered socio-economic development. Now you ask me what it takes to get there. So this is what I would say. Russia has no say over Ukraine's politics. Russia is not able to put at risk physically Ukrainian statehood and the Ukrainian nation, and Ukraine has free and secure access to the Black Sea. That's absolutely important if we are talking about the viable Ukrainian state. Now, you may say it's pretty general, but I would say that... Yeah,
it is actually, that's what I want to say.
But it is for a purpose. So Woodrow Wilson was general to the same extent in 1918 when he told you about Poland and Polish independent state. I mean, I would say it's clear enough to steer our thinking in the long term, what we want from Ukraine and what we want from us, and it is vague enough intentionally to let Ukraine fill it with substance. Please take notes that I intentionally didn't mention borders. I didn't mention any kind of deal between Ukraine and Russia. That's up to Ukraine to decide if, when, and on what terms. It's still within this theory of victory that I mentioned. It starts with securing what is there, here and now, because I always say that Putin is kind of dog in the manger. He thinks, he believes that either he has Ukraine or he will destroy it and anyone can have it. It means that we would have to secure Ukraine physically, Ukrainian statehood, but Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian population as such. Rebuilding a country is way easier than rebuilding a nation. I mean, reproducing a nation in the long term. And this is something that we have to consider at this moment as well. I mean, Putin tries to break the DNA of the Ukrainian nation. We have to consider that the population in Ukraine, demographic situation, which is worrying, that should worry us as well. Now, pretty quickly, because there is
really quickly.
Yes,
because
this is something that I wanted to ask Corey yesterday, but I didn't have the chance to do it. But there is a dilemma, and I think this dilemma should be solved. I think it runs deeply to the DNA of the Western world. We are ashamed of victory. We think that we are much better than that. Mm-hmm. We are trying to look for off-ramps. We are trying to avoid humiliation of our opponents. We're trying to come up with a win-win solution, cooperative approach. But there is always someone who has to lose and someone who has to win. Now, I know this is a fancy word now, building bridges in Washington. So I would leave you with a question. How to build a bridge between win-win approach on one hand, which means that no one loses, and the art of winning, which essentially means that someone has to lose.
Daniel, thanks. I mean, I actually would like to go now to Yevgeniya and then to Pavlo, because the Ukrainians, they have to answer. And not only please share your initial thoughts, but also respond to one thing which actually started to jar me recently, and that is this idea that, well, you know, it's for the Ukrainians to decide on the conditions of winning. And, you know, it increasingly, for me, maybe I'm wrong, by the way, starts to sound as if, well, you know, you'd better decide quickly that you can't win. So you'd rather grab a moment when, you know, there are still some conditions that could be beneficial for you. Is it so? So, please, Yevgeniya and then Pavlo.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's always great to be back to Poland, and because I'm speaking here in my personal capacity, I also want to start by thanking the Polish people for all the support that you provided to Ukrainians in the start of the full-scale invasion, and to all the friends and allies here in the room. We really appreciate it as Ukrainians, and that's something that is part, I believe, of our formula of victory. Going to your question, I think that for Ukrainians it's pretty clear what is Ukrainian formula of victory and what is up to Ukrainians to decide, because it's 1991 borders, the only internationally recognized borders, but it's not only about that. It's also about the return of political prisoners, kidnapped children, more than 20,000 only officially recognized, and many other things that are pretty clear. So I don't think there is a change there, and I don't think there will be a change, because we're not talking about territories, we're talking about people who live in the occupied territories. And that's not about a occupation, that's not about changing administration or changing currency in the occupied territories. That's about physical extermination of people. If we look at what happens in Kharkiv, for example, which is not occupied now, but under constant attacks of the Russian side, and how everything is destroyed. Ukrainian DNA mentioned by Daniel, but also it goes from, publishing houses, from libraries, to civilians, to hospitals, as you know it. So for us, for Ukraine, that's not a question whether we change it or not. But very briefly, 2 points, because we're talking not only about what the victory for Ukraine would be, but also what is in the toolbox and how to achieve it. I would say that if you don't know what to do, just read classics. And because we're talking about the art of winning, I would also remind the art of war by Sun Tzu, who said that, to avoid strength, you need to strike weaknesses. Do we know the Russian weaknesses and vulnerabilities? We know. And mostly that's about economy, that's about resources, that's about dependence on technologies which come from the West, dual-use goods which are still unfortunately there on the Russian market. It's also about dependence on revenues from oil, which is still, this trade in oil, it's still there. So I do think that it's very important to come up with a comprehensive strategy, not only what can be done and should be done on the battlefield, a decisive defeat of Russia, but also a geo-economic strategy of curtailing and curbing all these illegal economic activities which enable Russia to continue its war effort in Ukraine. And of course, the second part is actually strike these weaknesses. So for that, Ukraine must be enabled to strike that, including deep into Russian territory.
Thanks a million. Pavlo, I would like you to address, among other things, your remarks, this Yevgeniya's idea about the necessity of more comprehensive, if you wish, sanctions and pressure and probably secondary sanctions and things like that. You're former foreign minister. Is it realistic from your point of view?
It has to be. Good morning. I was born in the Soviet Union, spent considerable...
Hold your mic up slightly.
Okay,
Yeah.
it works. Okay, happy. I was born in the Soviet Union. I spent part of my life there. And I was enthusiastic, as many Ukrainians, about our independence. But it was a fundamental question for me, what is the point of no return in the sense of leaving the sense of Russian sphere of influence of the Russian world? And my point, we are there. The point of no return has been crossed, and we are out. It's part of whatever happens in the future, really. It's my sense, not from opinion polls, it's my sense from talking to people, we are out. It would never ever be accepted by the Russian leadership, maybe by kind of different Russia in the future, but not today and not tomorrow. For the people in power in Russia, there is no Ukraine as such. There is either Russia, kind of wrong Russia, or anti-Russia, like Putin famously wrote in his article, but no Ukraine. The moment Russia would be forced to accept Ukraine exists, Ukrainians exist, Ukrainian as language exists, our history is there, would be also part of our victory and also part of our common victory as the Western one. Third, we are not in, and we have to become part of the European space. I mean, not just geographically, but the space of values, European Union, NATO, but fundamentally understanding that it's also for the West the point of credibility. The point of credibility towards the current Russian regime, but it's the same way point of credibility towards everybody else. So for me, the sense of what we have to achieve is, of course, about our land. Of course, it's about our people. But about clear sense that we are resilient as society, as a nation, we are democratic, and we are part of the West. And it's how actually the sense of victory looks like for me.
But still, what can be done? Because that's a very important point, I think, what Yevgeniya raised about more economic warfare by the West, more stringent attitudes to, the Modis, the Lulas, the Ramaphosa's of this world that facilitate the war. As a government minister, former government minister, what is lacking? I mean, maybe Ukraine is not making its case strong enough. Maybe there is too much vested interest. What do you think? Because I do think it's very important.
Russia is still part of the system. Russia is still part of the world economy, in the sense of oil, in the sense of metals, in the sense of financial flows. And whatever sanctions you can impose, there is always a way to circumvent them. If the better you're gonna get with the sanctions, the better is the Russian resilience, because the Russians also can learn from everybody else, from their comrade Kim Jong-un or whoever. But fundamental point, the West has all the leverages to raise the stakes. The clear point in Moscow has to be whatever is our efforts to be more resilient towards the Western sanctions, in the very next moment, the West is ready to raise the stakes further. We clearly understand that to raise the stakes in one batch is not a current policy. But at least in the sense of consistency, there should be crystal clear understanding at the Kremlin. The next moment, there are going to be next raising of the stakes, and there should be the same understanding everywhere else. And it's the only credible way forward.
Thank you. Marie.
Thank you, Kostya. The key issue, in my view, is commitment today. That is morale and conviction. The strong belief that defeat, Ukrainian defeat, is impossible, and that victory is possible. And I think the moment we can convince everyone, especially our governments, of this impossible defeat, possible victory, will make huge progress. Defeat is impossible. First, because the Kremlin has no war objective and has no peace objective. So they cannot stop the war, even at their conditions. Defeat is impossible because it would mean that Kharkiv becomes Putingrad. And I think if we say these kind of things to the Germans, to the French,
Mike.
Yes, it really, it will make a difference. Because that's what would mean defeat, right? Like in Grozny today, where you have a Putin Avenue. And victory is possible because we, the allies of Ukraine, with Ukraine, we know exactly what a just peace is. A just and lasting peace. We know exactly what we want.
What?
And
what does the West want? Explain to me.
But before I go into we go into more details, I would like to say that my inspiration has always come from Poland and from the Czech authors as well, from Kundera and from Czesław Miłosz. I was very fortunate to be a grad student at Harvard when Miłosz was giving a series of lectures just after he won his Nobel Prize of Literature. And I remember reading his book, The Other Europe, and the first page about Vilno, where he was born, and that changed statehood at least 4 or 5 times in a few decades. And that's why I had, I'm saying this about Kharkiv or Mariupol or Donetsk, because we have to talk about people that live in native cities. We need to talk about people to make this war, as you did, Yevgeniya, to make things just unforgettable. Because in our discourse, we have to say things that people will not forget. Now, what Miłosz has spent his life struggling with was indifference in Europe and lack of will to understand what was going on in the Europe of, after the First World War and after the Second World War.
Mike.
Now, today, we are making the history of the new other Europe. The first other Europe is in Europe, and I think is more or less fine. So the new other Europe is Ukraine, the Belarusian, the Ukrainian, the Moldovans, the Armenians, the Georgians. So we know that those nations, those peoples, those countries belong to Europe. And I can assure you that the great majority of the French now think of those countries as European. So we've gone a long, long way. And
Maria said
I will be happy.
3 minutes, please.
Yes.
We have to give it to the
Sure.
others, and we have to go back to practical issues. I think there's one thing very interesting that you mentioned, and that is the what was mentioned yesterday too by Corey, for example. You have to speak to the publics. You have to explain why Kharkiv is important for Monsieur Dupont from Strasbourg. What I think that what we do know, what we agree on a toolbox, certain agreement we do see already. So one is, of course, providing arms for Ukraine. That's no doubt about that. Secondly, it's an expanded economic warfare against the Russian regime. Thirdly, it's working with the Western publics to convince them that it's completely indispensable for them to support Ukraine and to have Ukraine win. I would like to ask Daniel, do I miss anything?
Several pieces of puzzle are still missing.
Please.
Yeah, the first one is, the war has never been framed in terms of territory. You mentioned that, but not precisely. Even Russia didn't formulate precisely territorial claims. This is the war about Ukrainian statehood. This is what is at stake, not territory. If there is a problem and the Russian troops cannot hold ground, they withdraw, like from Kiev, from the Zhemyny Ostrov, so the Snake Island, etc. So this is about statehood, and the end state must be the end state is about statehood as such. This is what matters. But if you likely try to talk to the Western public about the Ukrainian statehood, that this is what Putin attempted to do, this won't fly. So I would suggest a bit different conversation with the Western public. And did you have Ukrainian troops in Berlin? Yes. Did they ask to go there? I'm rather not sure. So if Putin is able to capture Ukraine, he will get this grip on the resources physically, on the people, on the mineral resources, on the material base, and he will send Ukrainians for a war with us. This is why Kharkiv matters, and this is why all these small villages in eastern part of Ukraine matter.
You mentioned something which I think is a very, very touchy and sensitive issue here. You said this war is not about territory. This war is about Ukrainian statehood. And, I mean, it sounds, and by the way, it's very relevant to what we are discussing. If territory is not that important, and I would like to basically engage Yevgeniya and Pavlo into this conversation, we know the proposition. If somehow Putin is stopped at a certain point, and essentially whatever he manages to keep is exchanged for NATO and EU membership, probably quick, fast-track NATO membership. It's not about territory, but the statehood is preserved. Is it an option? But literally 20 seconds.
So one sentence, because I think this is completely the other way around. For Putin, because this is not about territory, land for peace would not fly, because 20% of the Ukrainian territory being occupied by Russia doesn't matter for Putin.
Yevgeniya.
I would actually go beyond that. It's not only about Ukraine, because we're talking about Ukrainian people, we're talking about Ukrainian territories. This is not a war only about Ukraine or in Ukraine. And yesterday we had great panels, and I wanted to ask a question. We had a panel about defeating Russia on the battlefield and beyond. And we never got to that beyond part, because for me, this is also Russia's war on the West. And when we're talking about irregular warfare, my question is, what are the threat perceptions in your respective countries? Do you think that there is a threat coming from Russia? So when you mention something missing in the whole situation there, I would actually mention this cognitive shift and recognition of the fact that Europe is at war. At least Russia is very vocal and very clear about that. When you listen to President Putin, what he says, Russia is at war with NATO. When we listen to NATO, what we hear from the NATO side, we're not at war with Russia, and we don't want to be dragged into war with Russia. And we're not warmongers. No one wants to have a third world war, etc., etc. But now it's about unconditional war, and it is there. So for me,
Mike up.
For me, the very important thing here is to realize that if Putin gets what he wants in Ukraine, and I think that even 5% of the territory of Ukraine would be actually victory for President Putin, then nothing would stop him from other aggressive acts. And look what's happening in Africa now. Control over critical minerals, over rare earth elements. Look about Russia's outreach to the Latin America, to the so-called global south, which we did not actually discuss too much, but which matters, especially when it comes to the economic warfare and keeping Russian economy afloat, and about all the active measures which are there not only since 2007, but since the Soviet times, since Russian Empire actually. So now with Russia moving from disruption to destruction in Europe, I think what we're missing out from the whole debate and discussion about peace for territories, territories for peace, Putin doesn't care about swaths of land in Ukraine. Putin cares about strengthening his positions, the footprint in Europe, and then going beyond that. So it's not only about Ukraine. When we're talking about donations to Ukraine, providing support and aid to Ukraine, Ukraine appreciate that. But that's investment in the European security. Because I agree with many points that Mary made, but I would not probably put Belarus, Ukraine, Armenia in the same bucket, because we're on the very different levels right now. And I would say that supporting Ukraine, we support the new Europe, European security, and also transatlantic security. And this is, I think, this mental shift, cognitive shift is important, including when we communicate it to our societies in Europe.
Pavlo, you have anything to add very briefly, and then I'd like to address a question to Marie.
Yes. I don't know how many years Putin gonna be in power. But let's see, we are in 50 years from now. What does he want? Actually, the Russian kids reading about him in big books, staying in front of the Putin's monument, like Marie said, at the Putin's Avenue somewhere. For that, there should be a sustainable Russian regime. So the new invention is to say Russia is actually a sort of civilization, not part of Europe, but a special civilization, kind of aping up the Chinese, the Indians, the Iranians. But China and India are actually civilization disguised as states. Russian culture, 19th century, is basically European. The simple point, what is special about the so-called Russian civilization? And if you get Ukraine out of the equation with all kind of history, about orthodoxy and all kind of stuff. So fundamentally, how can you put your point about the special character of the Russian civilization, and how can you make the Russian regime sustainable? And if it's not sustainable, what is about Putin? Putin is not sustainable, and Putin is not sustainable, so what's about Russia? So fundamentally, this point is not just about any sort of deal. And if we want to have a new status quo, we need a sustainable status quo. And sustainable status quo should not be about a kind of deal. And if we make a deal, the future is not about rules. Forget about it. The rule-based world is over. The whole sense of benefiting the rule, it's over. So it's about deals. If you want to enter into about getting deals, good luck. It's not about myself.
Thanks, Pavlo. Marie, coming back to the toolbox, and we're still talking about, I would rather say, a Ukrainian Western offensive against Russia. Not military, but first and foremost, political, which is, of course, also in a certain way underpinning the military component. If we look at the actually coming months and even weeks, I would say, in your personal view, do you think that NATO should make some kind of very clear announcement in Washington that, well, essentially it invites Ukraine to join, number one. Number two, I know it was discussed briefly, but I do think that's maybe quite a game changer. Do you think that some NATO troops from allied countries should be deployed in Ukraine very visibly, let's say in support roles, biological and chemical weapons specialists, but really deployed on the ground, at least at the beginning, just to show that NATO and the West stand with Ukraine? And by the way, under the UN Charter, Ukraine can actually ask for assistance. You don't need NATO for that. So do you think there needs to be, as a toolbox, if you wish, do you need these practical and at the same time symbolic steps?
First, I'd like to emphasize what Pavlo just said. You don't make deals with a paranoid tyrant. You know, it doesn't work. We've been trying for 4 or 5 years, it's not working. There's absolutely no way it's going to work now when the man, is under an arrest warrant from the International Court. So let's stop. I mean, it's not even on the table to make any deal with him. What I would add to answer one of your questions, Kostya, is you can no longer talk to the man. We can't talk to him, but his advisors, his military commanders cannot talk to him. The man is no longer in a mental capacity to listen, to make plans, to strategize. So the thing is, and I think that's an important point in the answer to your question about military action and more than a show of force, but real force on the ground, is that the people we have to send very strong messages to with practical actions are the military commanders. That the guys we can aim at, and maybe a few members of the Putin clan. When we start looking at it this way, I think we find ourselves empowered, because we keep saying it's a huge destructive war that is threatening not only the Ukrainians or the Moldovans, but the whole of Europe and whatever very fragile balance of power there was in Europe in the last 30 years. So yes, the message that those people that are making most of the decisions the message they would hear very well is not a show of force, but be present in Europe, because Ukraine is Europe. And let's not forget that in June 2022, only 4 months after the beginning of the aggression, the European Union gave candidate status to Ukraine, and if I'm not mistaken,
So
to Moldova as well.
Should be a NATO candidate status?
No, what I'm saying is that it is Europe. This is why I quoted Miłosz. It's no longer the other Europe. And this is why I insist, it's very important that Belarusian society, Georgian society, Armenian society are going along the same way. The number one priority today is to win the war on the battlefield. This is the emergency. All the rest, yes, we are doing, and we also have to do better. And economic, but we need more and more wins on the battlefield. The battlefield is not only the front line, it's also the Black Sea, where you are doing very well, and other. So to do this, it seems to me that now, in NATO and within a number of the member states of NATO, it is discussed every day the possibility of having man on the ground. How that will be done, and how each country might choose to be present on the ground.
Should they be present on the ground? Marie, should they be present on the ground? My question is very simple.
Yes, of course.
Yes or no?
But yes, of course. I mean, it's already, first, it's already the case. We do have thousands and thousands of people, whether they're engineers, technical militaries. You cannot support Ukraine militarily the way we are doing it without having our own people there. So the question of being there with, I think, just troop soldiers, it's not the most important. And actually, I understand that it is not for the Ukrainian army. This doesn't seem to be the priority. We have to listen to them, because they have,
Marie, I'm really sorry, I have to stop you.
Many mistakes.
Because it seems like we're not getting an answer to the NATO question. Yeah, Daniel, should Ukraine be invited to join NATO? Is it a tool, a useful political, diplomatic, and pressure tool against Russia? I'm talking about Washington in July.
Yes, I think so. That long
Good
explanation.
Now,
and we missed an opportunity a year ago.
Yes, absolutely. Vilnius, and quite a few of us probably were in Bucharest in 2008. I'm sorry, it was like watching Bucharest again, but without Rogozin drunk.
Let me follow with a couple of sentences. So, conditions are quite clear. What we should be talking in our modalities. Conditions are there. We know what are the conditions. The discussion about the conditions is useless. I would say. I mean, it's just a waste of time. Now, the whole concept of building a bridge. Now, there's a problem with a bridge. I have two problems with the concept of a bridge. The first one is that I was around Kiev quite early in 2002. Bridges were the first one to be blown up when the Russians invaded. So I wouldn't be, I don't like bridges, because bridges are kind of infrastructure that tanks strike on it. And I'm the first one to be blown. And then I saw several bridges in Poland. I come from a remote region in Poland, the eastern one, which is rather underdeveloped. You can imagine a bridge that there is absolutely no way that goes there. It just stands somewhere in the middle of nowhere. This is kind of bridge that we are trying to build now between NATO and Ukraine. That's my problem with the whole concept of building bridges.
Thanks. We still have 15 minutes, so I'd like to touch upon something. Yes, Yevgeniya. Yes, and that is why I want to touch upon two things very briefly, at least to leave 7-8 minutes for questions. But one question to Yevgeniya. If we're discussing the toolbox, there's this debate fading in and fading out regularly about the impact. Actually, Marie touched upon it. Whether Ukraine and the Western allies should strive to impact Russian public opinion, maybe trying to shake it out of this indifference and the to tear down the do not disturb sign from the Russian door. And secondly, to impact the regime in a sense that it is a vast bureaucracy. which has its vulnerabilities. If possible, briefly, please.
Yes, and I will answer to both questions about NATO and about your second question with one response. Ukraine must become a NATO member, and that will help shape opinion in Russia and in Russian elites, and that will also help ensure Ukraine's security. I will explain. Talking about Russia, I don't have, with all due respect, I don't have any hope for the Russian opposition as it is now, for the Russian public opinion. I have very close family members in Russia who are supportive of this war, and I believe it's not only a result of being brainwashed, and I don't think Ukraine or any of the Western countries can actually influence the processes which are happening inside Russia. And we know that very often, and that's also something that Yevgeniya mentioned the first day, that it's impossible to have an influence on what's happening inside Russia. Very often it's just random and unpredictable. What we can do is to make sure that whatever happens in Russia, whatever the regime change is, whatever the developments in Russia are, we as a political West, let's say, we're very well prepared for that, and we have enough defense and deterrence capabilities to be quite sure that we are okay independently of what happens within Russia. This is one thing. About NATO, very briefly, but I think this is also very important. After NATO has trained Ukrainian soldiers, and Ukraine has 1 million at least very capable, highly experienced military, does NATO want to have them on board to protect NATO from Russia or in a grey and buffer zone? After having invested, and hopefully in the future as well, billions of euros and dollars in Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction, do we want to provide Ukraine with the air defense systems to protect this infrastructure or not? Do we want to have that as part of NATO or not? Another question. Yesterday we were discussing the Black Sea and how the maritime power is key to winning any war. The Black Sea now is pretty much a Russian-Turkish lake. It used to be. With Ukraine's successes in the Black Sea, this dynamics is now changing. Ukraine has been able to degrade Russian capabilities, destroy 1/3 of the Russian fleet. Now, with the Montreux Convention there is no other change to increase NATO's naval presence in the Black Sea, except with the exception of Ukraine to NATO, because Ukraine is a literal state, so there is no violation of the Montreux Convention. You have Turkey, which sees Russia pretty much as an economic partner, but also a strategic rival, and this membership of Ukraine in NATO would actually increase the presence and naval capabilities of NATO in the Black Sea. So I wouldn't only look at this situation of Ukraine trying to knock the door of NATO, but also of NATO, which probably should be interested in having Ukraine on board because there is no other options left. And then in Russia, with public opinion, with opposition, let's now turn the tables and say, let's leave it to Russians to decide what they want inside their country, and let's be sure that we are prepared to face any scenario, any threats, and any challenges coming from whatever Russia we have in the future.
Well, at the same time, you can say, to flip your argument, if you look at the Second World War, there were attempts to impact public opinion in Germany. There was the BBC German service. There were broadcasts by the Soviets into the German territory. There were defectors that were broadcasting to Germany, leaflets and so. Well, I mean, technologies were different. Why you think it should be forsaken now? Why do you think it's useless?
Because how much interested the Russian population is in getting unbiased
I'm answering the question.
information.
Not very interesting. Not very interested, no.
So how come the media, first of all, I don't think that all opposition media is really opposition, even if they have offices in Europe. That's not necessarily the case. Yes. But second thing there, I don't really see how people who are absolutely not interested in politics, brainwashed, and for centuries and centuries have this imperial mindset, can change this mindset without decisive Russian defeat on the battlefield. That's why sanctions are important. That's why Russia's decisive defeat is important for the Russian population to understand that there is something wrong with this country. And this public reckoning is important. With media, unfortunately, I don't believe you can change it.
Thanks. Pavlo, 30 seconds.
And I believe we can. The black box is not totally black. One of the fundamental problems here in the West, discussion about containment and deterrence, but it's all a kind of defense mood. And the Russians are different, the Chinese are different, so why not to become proactive in some moment in time? And it's a fundamental problem. We need to start working proactively and building strategies. It's like an alternative simulation. We need to understand what we need out of Russia. It's not about regime change. It's something completely different. But the black box is not totally black, or at least we need to make it not really black.
Pavlo, thanks for that, because I would like to address it to the directorship and to the experts of PISM. Maybe that's a topic for another conference or a seminar, because frankly, that's a discussion that keeps popping up regularly. Now, we have 8 minutes left, and I open the floor for questions, and I would like to ask our panelists just maybe to mention, if anyone feels like, during the answers, if there are any lessons to be drawn from the resistance to Russian aggression against Ukraine with regard to policies that can be implemented with regard to China, DPRK, and Iran. And now to questions. I'll stand up to see better. Who's there? Are there any hands? Oh, Agnieszka, please. I see you first. Gentleman over there, right? Okay.
Szeligowski from PISM. Very quick question, because I have different impression from this panel. Very quick question and answer. Do you think that if Ukraine fail, the next step Putin will do against any NATO member states?
Thank you. Who is...
Take several questions, maybe.
You want several questions?
Yeah, because we have very little time to answer.
We'll see. Okay, yeah, fine. I agree. You're now the master of ceremonies. Yes, the gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. Patrick Kugiel, PISM. I would like to thank Mrs. Yevgeniya Gaber for bringing in the Global South into this discussion. And my question is, how do you think, how important is the position of Global South and support from the Global South countries for winning the war? Because, and what do you have in the toolbox to convince those countries, including the important ones like India, Brazil, or South Africa, to condemn the Russian aggression, to stop doing business with Russia, to isolate Russia, etc.? Because my fear is that without engaging the Global South, this conversation, this discussion among only the transatlantic community will only reinforce this sentiment, this perspective in the rest of the world. Then the war in Ukraine is actually a proxy war between the West and Russia. So how important is the role of the Global South? And do you think the conference in Switzerland in June may be
Thanks a million. Your question is pretty clear. Thanks a million. Please be brief. I don't see any hands, but are there any? Is there a third question? No. So, who wants to volunteer to answer?
Let me start. On the first one, the short answer is yes. I believe and consider it an educated guess, not a wild guess. In some moment in time, Putin will try to test Article 5. Maybe not in a military way. But it's a sort of thinking which is definitely there. And it's a fundamental point for him, but not just for him. For the others who are now, in a way, supportive. On the Global South, I don't believe Global South does exist. It's neither South nor global. But I talk a lot to the guys in the non-Western world. And the overall perception is a proxy war. And wait and see what gonna happen. If Ukraine and the West win, so it's gonna be one version of the reality in the 20th century. If not, it's gonna be a kind of fork and the second or the third version of the reality. So it's not about lacking sympathy. It's about a fundamental anti-Western animosity and especially American animosity there. And in the sense of US and Western credibility, it could be a game changer or not?
Pavlo, before I give the mic to Marie, just one very quick follow-up regarding the possible sort of operation, let's say, Russian operation against NATO and testing Article 5. There is this sort of more or less accepted wisdom: Putin is not going to do it as long as there is war going on in Ukraine. Do you agree with it? Because personally I have doubts about it. I think that he likes to think out of the box on that.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's a wisdom and it's accepted by someone. I believe the test is quite likely. It's just not about tanks here around Warsaw. It's we live in a fundamentally different world. It would be a combination of different pressure from migration till kind of, but testing it to the limit of the internal solidarity within NATO. And I believe the plans are ready. The only point is how to use it, under what conditions, and what going to be the consequences.
Thank you. Marie, you wanted to add something? Mike.
I have a different analysis, but I may be wrong. But I hope you're wrong and I'm right.
I would be happy.
Yes, I know. First, the Russian army is not doing very well in Ukraine. First point. And you also emphasize...
Marie, you have 30 seconds, literally.
Yes, okay. No, but this is really the important question that Agnieszka raised, and I do not agree. Because first it would mean that they win militarily, I don't know what, but they are much stronger and that the Ukrainian army is defeated, which I don't see. And then why would they risk Latvia or Poland? So I'm just repeating myself. Putin will not make those decisions, but military commanders will when it comes to the territory of a NATO member state. So if they all want to commit suicide, then, you know, we are beyond reason and reality. But I do understand your point in Poland and in Lithuania to say, you know, they have an ambition of, no, they may have whims and big emotions and passions. But let's always study the capacity.
Thanks. Daniel, 36, before we go for the last question.
There are two components of the Russian defeat. The first one, Russia must be defeated decisively. The second component is Putin himself must acknowledge that he has been defeated. And this second component is extremely important. Now, our message to him is as long as it takes. His response is as long as it takes, and one day later we will win. So we have to create facts on the ground, something that is hardly reversible, because from his perspective, everything is reversible. You know what is hardly reversible, or at least it takes a lot of time? Building a huge defense industry in Europe. This way, we would tell them, you already lost.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Last question.
Global
very
South
briefly.
question, if I may?
No. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much. A quick question on the to pick up on the imperial mindset. I fully share your view, Yevgeniya, that this is not Ukrainians' business, that this has to be internal process in Russia. But I was also encouraged to hear what Marie said, that European or French publics do consider Belarusian Georgians as part of Europe. But I wonder whether we in Europe, in the West, can do more. We are very complacent in that. I think we've had just the first Ukrainian studies program opened in the UK.
The question is clear. Thank you very much. Thanks a million.
And
Yevgeniya,
whether
please.
we can also encourage the internal process inside Russia through doing things in Europe to start discussing about the imperialist mindset.
Yevgeniya, since you are the expert on fighting Russian imperialism.
No, I think the question was about France, so I cannot speak to that.
I think it was you were mentioned first.
There's one comment I would like to make in response to your...
Mike.
You don't want to go first? Your question is very important because I also have a slightly different approach to Yevgeniya's approach. Because I'm French, because I have, as a French, a European, a huge responsibility in what's going to happen in Ukraine, but also in what's going to happen in the Federation of Russia in the years to come. So this is where I think we have to do what we all did in 1943, was to anticipate the post-war situation. And we have to start as early as today to think of how we will accompany the many peoples and societies of the Federation of Russia to rebuild their societies, their republic, their country under international supervision. Because what happens in Russia is absolutely our concern. I mean, security on the continent means that we do have responsibility in what's going to happen in Russia later for the sake just of people there. And this is not regime change.
Thank you very much. This is the final point. I would like to thank Yevgeniya Gaber. Yevgeniya Gaber, Pavlo Klimkin, Marie Mendras, and Daniel Szeligowski for this panel. Please thank them too.
Konstantin, please join us over here to some follow-up on the panel. So, a lot of very concrete ways. Yeah, that would be useful. So, a lot of concrete ways of defeating Russia have been enumerated during the panel. And I wanted to ask you about your take on that. So, what's, in your opinion, are like maybe not 10 commandments, but 4 commandments on how to defeat Russia? What is like sort of the best of the panel?
I think that, first and foremost, we didn't dwell much on the military aspects of the defeat. And that is, I think, quite understandable, because everyone here, at least in this audience, understands the importance of the military component. We talked about it a lot, so that was a given in a certain way. I think the second idea, which came through, by the way, pretty clearly, is that there has to be not a symbolic but fairly visible presence of Western allies on the ground in Ukraine, because that will serve as Putin's deterrence. Number 3, diplomatic steps. That is important, both in terms of making, in Washington, making, again, a visible movement towards Ukraine's membership in NATO, as well as trying to impact the global South. And I think the 4th point, and that remains quite contentious, and I think it's a very interesting point for further discussions, and that is, how do you influence both the Russian regime and the Russian public opinion? And I was quite surprised, actually, that there was such a lively debate inside the debate about that, and that, I think, means that it's not only a matter for, you know, the so-called Russian opposition, or whatever you call it, but it is also a strategic matter which should be considered within the framework of all discussions about the toolbox.
Konstantin, thank you very much for your contribution to the strategic arc. Thank you.